Hi, I hope you've noticed how well dressed I am today. I did this for a purpose because I wanted to show you some of the areas associated with Unit 4 in terms of the shoulder complex. This complex contains 3 synovial joints. One of these joints is sitting right here, right anteriorly here, right there. And it's the end of the clavicle where the clavicle meets the sternum, and if you move you can feel the clavicle moving. It's a saddle joint. It has a disc. There are ligaments associated with it that stabilize it. There's one that crosses the top of the clavicle and the sternum and the other clavicle, and that's the interclavicular ligament. There's a ligament in the front and back called the anterior and posterior sternoclavicular ligament, and the rib sits right underneath it, and there's a ligament coming from the rib to the clavicle called the costoclavicular ligament. If we move laterally and follow the clavicle, it comes to an area, a flattened area here, and that flattened area is known as the acromion process. And if you come back a little bit, you'll be able to feel, if you move your arm in rotation and back and forth, you'll be able to feel movement at the AC joint or acromioclavicular joint. This joint may have a ligament on top called the acromioclavicular ligament, but it does have its major support coming from underneath the coracoid process, which is right here. And that has a ligament coming from the coracoid onto the clavicle called the coracoclavicular ligament. And there are 2 parts to that. There's a trapezoid and a conoid ligament. We go a little further here, and now we come up to the glenohumeral joint. Glenohumeral joint is named because of the glenoid fossa here of the scapula and the humeral head. It sits like this. Here's the acromion. There's the coracoid. Now, coming from this, there are 4 ligaments anteriorly here associated with this glenohumeral joint. Coming from the coracoid onto the humerus is the coracohumeral ligament, and then there's 3 glenohumeral ligaments. There's a superior glenohumeral, a middle glenohumeral, and an inferior glenohumeral ligament. The back part of the joint is really secured by tendons. Okay? Now, if we look at the scapula and look at it, there's the humerus. On the top, there's this fossa. Yeah? This is the suprascapular fossa. This ridge is called the spine of the scapula. Below it, here is the infrascapular fossa, and on the other side is the subscapular fossa. Each of these has muscles coming from that going onto the humerus. Here, coming from the suprascapular fossa, coming across the top, there is the supraspinatus. Supraspinatus is a muscle that's going to abduct primarily the glenohumeral joint. Behind, from the infraclavicular fossa back here, and coming around in the back here, is the infraspinatus. The infraspinatus is going to cause primarily rotation, external rotation of the joint. And then in front here, the subscapularis comes over here and attaches onto the lesser tubercle, and that lesser tubercle that muscle is going to cause internal rotation. So the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and subscapularis are part of the rotator cuff. The other part is known as the teres minor. So if we look from the back here, okay, there was our infraspinatus, and coming from the edge here and coming up just about to where the infraspinatus attaches is the teres minor, and it makes up the 4th portion of the rotator cuff. Now, here, sitting at the top across all of them, is a muscle known as the deltoid. Deltoid is innervated by a nerve called the axillary nerve, which is very important. But the deltoid you can feel on yourself. It's a really interesting muscle, and it really has a lot to do with glenohumeral motion. This is it here. It has an anterior portion, it has a middle portion, it has a posterior portion. The anterior portion, you put your fingers here, you can feel it, flexes and internally rotates the glenohumeral joint. The middle portion here is an abductor. Okay? The posterior portion extends and externally rotates. So this muscle is really very important in terms of function of the glenohumeral joint itself. Okay? Now, as we move downward and underneath here, now we get into the axilla. Okay? Now, the axilla is bound anteriorly here by a muscle known as the pectoralis major, which is coming from the front here. In the back boundary of this axilla is the teres major and the latissimus dorsi. And then on the side here, coming out, is on the rib cage, is a muscle called the serratus anterior. Laterally here, right there, is the groove, intertubercular groove of the humerus, through which the long head of the biceps attaches, right through there. So you have your boundaries. Now, in this area, it's a fatty area, it's loose connective tissue, and that's because there's a lot of structures running in that area. One of these is the axillary artery, and the other one is parts of the brachial plexus. The axillary artery is a continuation of the subclavian coming from the heart, and once it crosses the clavicle and gets down here, it now becomes axillary artery. It then changes names in the arm to become brachial. It's one tube. Okay? Subclavian on top to the first rib, past the first rib, axillary all the way down to the teres major, and then becomes brachial. Okay? Now running with it is also the brachial plexus. Brachial plexus is a complex system of nerves, but they're responsible for the nerves of the entire upper extremity. It begins up in the neck. This area here is called the posterior cervical triangle. And in this area we have our ventral rami. Remember when we looked at the spinal cord and looked at the spinal nerves, and we said there was a spinal nerve divided into dorsal rami and ventral rami, and we talked about the dorsal rami running up the back here, going to the muscles here. Well, the ventral rami go off to the limbs and the trunk. Well, these are ventral rami, okay? And they're ventral rami of several different muscles, nerves, C5, C6, C7, C8, and T1, okay? The C5 and C6 component come together to form a trunk called the superior trunk. The middle is a loner, it stays as the middle trunk, and the other two, the C8, T1, form the inferior trunk. Now we have the rami in the trunk here located above the clavicle. That is why this portion of the plexus is called the supraclavicular portion. And off of that there are several nerves. Most of them we've already looked at. One is the dorsal scapular nerve, which goes to the rhomboids in the back, superficial muscles of the back, and the levator scapula. Remember those? The other one comes from C6, C5, C6, C7, and gets the muscle here along the side of the chest, or the serratus anterior. And then off the superior trunk are two muscles. Two nerves. One is the suprascapular nerve. Where'd you hear that nerve before? Suprascapular. Sounds familiar? Yeah. Suprascapular. That nerve comes in and does the supraspinatus, and then comes across and does the infraspinatus. Okay? And last in this area is the nerve to the subclavius, which is a small muscle under the clavicle. Now, these trunks then divide. They divide into anterior and posterior divisions. That division is basically taking place right underneath the clavicle. Okay? Now, from there, the divisions come together and they form the cord. So in the axillary region, we end up with cords. We end up with three cords. I don't know if you can see, but I'll try to do this. End up with three cords. This way. Okay? We end up with a cord. This is better. You see? End up with three cords. A lateral cord, a medial cord, and a posterior cord. Okay? Now, they're all named because of their relationship to the axillary artery. Now, I want you to look at where this lateral cord is going. It's going in here to the front part of your arm. Okay? The medial cord is coming here and going down to this area along the ulna, along this side. But the posterior cord is going deep. It's going to the other side, going to this part of the arm. Okay? And so we're now going to go and we're going to look at these compartments of the arm relative to these nerves. Okay? Good.